The bright side of addiction is recovery. And recovery begins with hope. If you're new to our podcast, we welcome you. If you have been here before, welcome back. And if you're in recovery or know or love someone who is, or simply want to know more about the recovery process, or maybe you're a bit concerned about someone that you know or love who is harmfully using alcohol or some other drug, this is the podcast for you as we carry the message of hope and the promise of recovery. And a reminder, you can find all of our podcasts at recoverycoasttocoast.org. Recent episodes have featured NFL player Ryan Leaf, authors Anne Lamott, J.A. Jantz, and Brene Brown, plus musician Bonnie Raitt and many, many others, plus conversations with everyday people in long-term recovery, people who are sharing their story, their insight, their path. And in this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast, as we are in summertime, Olympic summertime, with Paris being the setting for the 2024 Summer Olympics. We have a 3-time Olympic champion swimmer with us who took home the gold in the 1984 Games. Now, her life then spiraled into addiction, and there seemed to be no way out. After 3 tries of treatment, Carriie Bates finally came to find the long-term solution that she was searching for in one-day-at-a-time recovery. Here's a quick clip from my conversation with Olympic gold medal winner Carriie Bates.
Yeah, the Olympic gold medals, they sit comfortably in a safety deposit box, and they represent an amazing time in my life and certainly an amazing accomplishment. But really what they represent for me is the springboard onto the platform that I get today to use my story to help other people find recovery and to help other women reduce some of the shame that they feel.
That conversation in its entirety will begin shortly, and we will conclude our podcast with some wonderful words of wisdom about courage from an iconic actress, Ali McGraw. Our website is recoverycoasttocoast.org, and if you would like to help us out financially, or maybe you know of a foundation or a company that might be interested in underwriting part of a program, we would be very grateful. A reminder, our email address is recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. We'd love to hear from you. Recovery Coast to Coast is supported by Sundown M Ranch, one of America's oldest, least expensive, and most successful treatment programs. As I often say, recovery is as recovery does. And at Sundown M Ranch, and boy, they've been putting people on the road to recovery since back in March of 1968. That's right. Over 55 years of successfully treating people with addictive disease. There are literally thousands of treatment centers throughout the United States. There's big ones, small ones, new ones, ones that are high-end, others that are low-cost. Many treatment programs are for-profit organizations, and some of them just try to increase their financial bottom line. But at Sundown, their bottom line is long-term recovery for the patient. Plain and simple. Now, they can keep their costs low because, number one, they're a nonprofit program. Plus, they own their own land, 30 acres at the mouth of the beautiful Yakima River Canyon in Washington State. But make no mistake, they are not a silk sheet facility. This is not a recovery resort. Hardly. It's a medical facility, and they put the patient first. They're abstinence-based, 12-step centered, because that's worked for nearly 20,000 individuals and families. Since addiction is a family disease, it's important the family figures into treatment plans as well. Sundown has an exemplary family program. Now, the philosophy of treatment at Sundown has 3 main objectives: arrest the disease, provide needed support in the recovery process, and guide the individual back into a healthy and productive life. Their staff's been together for a long time, and they are top-notch. If you are researching treatment centers, I urge you to put Sundown M Ranch in the mix. Check out their website for more information, and take a look-see at their facility, which is, by the way, not far from Seattle. Sundown M Ranch, where recovery begins. Well, it's coffee time as I pour myself a nice big cup of coffee. Together, we will meet Carriie Bates. Again, it is Olympic season, the 2024 Olympics in Paris, France. And Carriie Bates looks back at her career, her Olympic career. She won 3 gold medals in the '84 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles. 4 years later, she didn't even qualify for the Olympics, and her dream of repeating was crushed. Coming from a home fraught with alcoholism, soon she was on a one-way journey to desolation, including the loss of her marriage and her children. It's truly a compelling story, a comeback story, as now she is in long-term recovery. Let's listen to my conversation with Carriie Bates at the 45th Annual NAATP Leadership Conference in Denver, Colorado. Welcome back once again to Recovery Coast to Coast on the road here in Denver, Colorado for the 45th annual meeting of NAATP, the National Association of Addiction Treatment Providers. And this is a great conference for me to come to because I meet a lot of new people and say hello to a lot of old friends and find some people who are close by the state of Washington. For example, Hazel and Betty Ford Foundation has a marvelous facility in Oregon. We're going to find out about that because Carriie Bates is the outreach manager of that. And also she is an Olympic gold medalist as well as a recovery gold medalist, I might add. Carriie, welcome to Recovery Coast to Coast. How are you?
Thank you. I'm great. How are you?
Good to see you.
Thank
Good
you.
to meet you. And you were telling me a little bit about your story. When did it begin for you? When did you begin the process? Because there were a number of steps in the process for you.
Oh yeah, there was a number of steps.
Take us back to the beginning, if you would.
Yeah, I think really the beginning for me, the first drink I ever remember taking for the sole purpose of not feeling was in 1988 when I did not make the Olympic team 4 years after being an Olympic gold medalist.
In what sport?
I was a swimmer. I swam the 100-meter freestyle and also 2 of the American relays.
What was that like when you didn't make it?
I had no plan B at that time in my life. There was no reason I wasn't on that Olympic team. There was no reason I shouldn't have made that Olympic team. I was still ranked number 1 in the world in the 100-meter freestyle. And I got to Olympic trials and I simply mentally fell apart. And I ended up first alternate on that team. And so I stood in the stands in Austin at the University of Texas, where I went to college. And I watched the whole 1988 Olympic team be assembled on the side of the pool deck. And I was in the stands not knowing what just happened to my life. My swimming really defined who I was. It was what gave me self-esteem. It's what gave me confidence. It was the thing that made me feel successful in my life.
What happened following the Olympics?
After not making the Olympic team in 1988, I decided to, quit swimming for all the wrong reasons. I did end up going back for about a year or so, and I was able to retire from the sport on my own terms. I got married, life moved on, and I had 2 beautiful children, but I also grew up in an alcoholic home. I believe for me, the pilot light for addiction, alcoholism was always lit. And it took me to get into the phase of my life where it really took hold and caught fire, so to speak, and really started to control my life.
What were some of the consequences of the drinking?
I had many. I lost my career. I spent almost 18 years at Nike. After being an Olympic champion, I worked in the sports industry for most of my career. I lost friends. I lost family. I lost a marriage, the father of my children. And at the end of the day, when I came home from the Betty Ford Center at 96 days sober, I walked into a courtroom and I lost legal rights to my children.
Oh, my goodness.
So I lost everything that mattered to me.
How did you come to go into treatment? What were the events that precipitated that magical moment?
I went to treatment 4 times in 2 years. I had a very difficult time.
Different programs?
Different program. Mm-hmm. Well, two. I went to Hazelden in Oregon twice. Mm-hmm. I had a brief stopover for a couple weeks at another provider, and then ultimately in February of 2012, I got on a plane by myself and I flew to the Betty Ford Center. And really the way I got there was not by some terrible event that had happened before. I just had gotten to the point where I couldn't drink anymore. What I did was I made a decision that I would try and detox at home alone, knowing it was dangerous, knowing I had every all potential of dying. And frankly, I really didn't want to survive. And I decided I would detox at home alone. And if I survived, I would go to treatment one more time and try and save my life. And so I started a very painful, dangerous 5-day detox in my home alone, hearing voices, televisions that weren't on, violently ill.
Anyone surrounding you during this time?
Nobody. I was alone.
Wow.
And I survived. And I knew at that point I had to honor what I had committed and to go and try one more time. You know, I think women that suffer with alcoholism and deal with a different stigma than men do. And then I think when you add in being a mom, it's crippling. I was told things like, you're a terrible mother, you're a horrible person, just disappear and don't come back, your kids will be better off. And I believed all of it.
Who was telling you these things?
People that were close to me in my life. And I believed them. And it's all BS. We aren't bad moms and we aren't bad people. We may do bad things when we're under the influence, but it's not organically who we are, and it certainly wasn't organically who I was. There was no question I loved my children more than as much as any mom or any parent loves their children. But addiction is stronger than love. And I knew that if I drank again that I would lose my children, and I drank again. Not because I wanted to, but because I was very sick.
What were those 90 days like for you?
The first 30 days were really tough. I was at a point in my life where I wasn't going to treatment to make friends. I wasn't there to sign people's big books. I went to the Betty Ford Center in 2012 to tell my truth, no matter what it looked like or sounded like to anybody there. I went to the Betty Ford Center to get honest for the first time in my life about who and what I had become in this disease. And I went there to try and save my life with the help of all of the team that it took to get me there. So the first 30 days were a little bit tough. When I moved into day treatment over on what we call the lane, that was really what I needed for my recovery. You know, I could do 28 or 30 days inside that bubble atmosphere and be successful. I could get A's on my projects and then I'd go home and get an F in life, you know. But I really needed to learn how to live sober, how to go to a grocery store and not buy booze, how to cook a meal and not drink, how to manage my emotions and not numb them with alcohol.
The only thing you had to change was everything.
Everything. And you know, people ask me all the time, how can you be the best in the world at something and not figure out this little problem you seemed to have with alcohol? And I even had to change everything that made me an Olympic champion. I had to change everything about that too in order to get sober, because everything I used to be that elite athlete were the very things that nearly killed me in my disease. Self-sufficient, don't ask for help, just think harder, you can figure your way out of this, train harder. If they had asked me, at least when I went to the Betty Ford Center, to run a marathon, that would have made more sense to me than this work that we have to do to connect the miles apart that our heart and our minds seem to feel when we're in active addiction.
Simple program, but not easy.
Not easy.
Not easy at all. So you get out of treatment after 96 days?
I was there 90 days.
90 days. And then you lost custody of your children?
I did. I went home, and my ex-husband, my children's father, felt that it was best for the children because I had proven that I wasn't having success leaving treatment and staying sober.
Okay.
So there was some fear, you know, for their safety, which I could understand. I'm not sure custody was necessarily the route I would have gone, but I do have an understanding of why he felt that they were safer not in my care. And really, what the judge said that day to me was so impactful because it really resonated with me from a recovering person standpoint. He looked at me and he said, all you have to do is stay sober 2 years and you get all your rights back. And you know, for those of us that are trying to get sober, 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, let alone 2 years sounds like forever.
Yeah.
I couldn't wrap my brain around how I was going to do that. But we did, right? Because I was surrounded by my 12-step program and people that loved me when my behind was falling off. Because it does. I had those women to tape it back on.
And you had the tools from the 90 days in treatment.
Correct.
To be able to deal with that devastating news that you'd lost your children for a while.
Correct.
How old were the kids at the time?
They were 13 and 10.
Oh my goodness. How did they handle it?
I'm not sure they ever really understood. I never told them that in so many words. I mean, they know now, certainly they're adults. I'm not sure their dad ever told them that. They still were able to spend time with me, but I had no legal rights to them. So when they would bring permission slips home from school, I had to tell them to take them to their dad. I had no right to sign those papers.
Oh.
So, I think we tried to protect the kids as much as we could during that period of time. And believe it or not, 12 and a half years of recovery have given me a great relationship and a great co-parenting relationship with their dad today too. So recovery isn't just for us. The people in our lives get to recover with us. And my daughters certainly have traveled this road with me. But even in a way, he did too.
What does recovery mean to you today, Carrie?
I mean, it's the one thing that I'm most proud of in my life, other than the birth of my children and who they are as people today. I remember when I first told my story publicly, I did it on Facebook at 4 years sober. It took me 2 years sober to just be able to look at myself in the mirror because I still had so much shame. And when I finally got the rights back to my children at 2 years, I finally felt, maybe whole or worthy again.
Mm-hmm.
And then at 4 years sober, I decided to share my story publicly. I certainly wasn't sick privately. And I decided I wasn't going to use the same behaviors that I had done in active drinking and hide.
You recovered out loud.
I chose to recover out loud and put a name, a first and last name to my story.
Nice.
My children chose to also recover out loud. They allowed me to speak at their school and high school. They post on Instagram about my recovery. And they have a story too. So we have, as a family, decided to recover out loud, and I think that, when we make that choice, we get to give a voice to the voiceless, a voice to the people that aren't ready to tell their story, or they're not well enough to tell their story.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Northern California. Went to school at the University of Texas, and I moved to the Portland area about 22 years ago.
Tell me about the Olympic gold medals.
Yeah, the Olympic gold medals. They sit comfortably in a safety deposit box. And they represent an amazing time in my life and certainly an amazing accomplishment. But really what they represent for me is the springboard onto the platform that I get today to use my story to help other people find recovery and to help other women reduce some of the shame that they feel.
What were the years of the awards?
I swam in 1984 and I won 3 gold medals.
So it must have been double blow to you then back in 1988. To not make it.
Correct.
You had made it all along and you just knew that this is just, a piece of cake.
Correct. It was definitely a major blow to my life. As a matter of fact, it's taken me 12 years in recovery to really connect all those things that had defined me to wrap into the one woman that I am today. Olympic champion, wife, mother, career person, recovering alcoholic. And those never connected for me until I found recovery.
What do you say to a woman out there who may be in a similar situation that you were in? That devastation, that utter hopelessness of, I've tried it before, it didn't work. I don't know if I'm going to continue to live.
Yeah. What I would say to that woman is that there is always hope. And the question isn't about where you reach out for help. It's what are you willing to do different this time to make it work? And I would also say that I believe that our freedom exists within our truth. And if you haven't ever been totally honest, like I wasn't the first 3 times I went to treatment, I wanted people to know only the pieces I was willing to share with them, the treatment providers, the staff, the women in the group, because that was my shame.
Yeah.
But when I finally let go of needing to control what people thought of me and just told my truth, I believe that was the very beginning of me being able to find my long-term recovery.
What was the first year in recovery like for you, Carrie? The
first year in recovery for me was very challenging. I had been to treatment before, so I didn't get to experience that pink cloud we talk about, that freedom, that early, I feel great. I had a lot of stuff going in my private life. I had been laid off from Nike after many years of service there. I had lost my children in the courts. I really didn't have a whole lot to hold on to. But what I tried to hold on to, and what the people around that surrounded me reminded me of every day, was that would pass too. That I would someday find myself back in the working field. Never did I imagine working in this field. And that I would have a relationship with my children that in that moment I couldn't comprehend. And they were right. I would tell a person coming into recovery today, don't write that script of what the next year or 5 years is going to look like in your life, because you'll sell yourself short.
My goodness. How did you come to get into the field? I mean, you're the outreach manager at Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation in Oregon. Used to be called Springbrook.
Yep.
And now it's Newburgh?
Now we refer to it as Newburgh, but I think for those of us that have been around for a long time, we'll always call it Springbrook.
I will always, sorry, Dr. Lee, I will always call it.
I do too sometimes.
Yeah.
I really made a decision after a couple years that I wanted to try and work in the recovery field. I just didn't really know where I fit. I had spent my whole career in sales and marketing, and I didn't know that existed within the treatment world. I knew I wanted to give back, and I knew I wanted to share my story, but I just didn't know how. So I started applying to Hazelden Springbrook online, like everybody does.
Wow.
And I was getting rejected for every job I applied for. So I ran into, at a community event, the site leader, our vice president in the
Northwest. Community event where? In Oregon?
In Tualatin, where I live. The VP of the Northwest happens to also live in Tualatin, the same city I live in. And we were at a mutual, at the same community event, and I spoke briefly at that event, and afterwards she came up to me and said, you should really consider making this a career. And I said, well, it's funny you say that, because I've applied to your facility 4 times and I keep getting rejected.
Wow.
Needless to say, I went from there, and I worked as a tech the first year. I worked in the center with the patients on swing shift, working till midnight, and I loved every second of it.
That is what someone might call a coincidence. I call it a God incidence.
Of course.
Putting you in the right place at the right time for the right reasons.
Yep. And it wasn't my time.
Right.
It wasn't on my time frame, but it certainly was on God's time frame. And when I was meant to find my footing firm enough to where I could give back to others in a real effective and hopefully impactful way.
Well, you are in a wonderful place now, both in terms of your life, your recovery, your career, and at Hazelden Betty Ford, the premier treatment program in America.
It felt like coming home, right? To be able to work for the very organization that saved my life means the world to me. And I remember when they hired me, I got the keys to Springbrook, and I was like, oh, clearly they didn't read my chart notes from when I was a patient there. And then when I finally got, my first paycheck, I was like, and it's the first time I'm not paying them,
Wow.
So, there's been a lot of little milestones, the number of days being employed versus being a patient, all those types of things. But it has been an amazing second career for me, and I've never felt better.
My goodness. Well, I believe that recovery is its own best reward. And I believe that, recovery is an American way of life.
I agree.
And recovery works.
Recovery works.
And we need to get that message out. Recovery is living proof, and you, Carrie, are living proof.
Yes. We don't have to hide anymore.
That's right. Absolutely. Out of the shadows into the sunlight of recovery.
Exactly.
Thank you, Carrie, for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I certainly hope you've enjoyed my conversation with 3-time Olympic gold medal winner and the winner of the Recovery Gold Medal, Carrie Bates. By the way, I want to remind listeners of this podcast, if you'd like to tell your story of recovery, regardless of the path that you've chosen, as long as you have been in continuous recovery for 1 year or more, please drop us a note at recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. Coming up next, some recovery insight from award-winning actress Ali McGraw.
She has always been your baby, but when your daughter got into drugs and alcohol, she turned into a stranger. What do you do? Where do you turn? contact Sundown M Ranch. Sundown's nationally recognized youth treatment program guides young people back to a life free of drugs and alcohol. All treatment is gender-specific and directed by caring certified professionals in a safe environment. You can get your daughter back and get to know her again. Go to www.sundown.org to learn more.
And now, as promised, some inspirational thoughts from a wonderful actress in long-term recovery, the great Ali McGraw.
As painful and unacceptable as our lives may have been, for quite some time it seemed easier to let things continue just as they were. It seemed easier to stay with the familiar, muddling through, barely coping, barely functioning. So we continued to make concessions and compromise our dreams. Year after year, as one example, many of us gave in to the frequently unreasonable or even outrageous demands of parents, partners, or others in our lives. It seemed easier to continue spiraling downward than to try to do something about our compulsions and addictions. So, day after tormenting day, many of us kept on doing the things that made us despise ourselves. It seemed easier to go on living in quiet desperation than to take the first step and reach out for help. It took courage, a great deal of courage, to make a commitment to getting well. It took courage to admit the scope of our problems and to surrender. It took courage to listen with an open mind and meet new friends. It took courage to choose a new direction and begin turning our lives around. Thought for today: recovery is the easier, softer way.
Well, that wraps up this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. If you have enjoyed our podcast, and I certainly hope that you have, I encourage you to share it with at least one other person. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, our email address is recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. Also, please hit the subscribe or follow button. It's absolutely free, and you'll be notified the next time we publish a podcast. Remember, if you know someone who is experiencing problems with alcohol or any other drug, here's a 24-hour national helpline. It's free information, free confidential treatment referrals, and they have Spanish-speaking individuals available as well. 1-800-622-HELP. And we encourage you to check out findsupport.gov. It's a website designed for individuals, families, and friends, including information on how to pay for treatment, including low-cost and free treatment options. Find healthcare support there as well as information on how to help someone else or find help for yourself. It's all in one place, findsupport.gov. And join us next time for America's Voice for Recovery, Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. And another shout-out to our sponsoring organization, the good folks at Sundown M Ranch, where recovery begins. Sundown.org. I'm Neil Scott, reminding you to stay healthy, live in gratitude, and be kind to others. Remember, the bright side of addiction is recovery. Pass it on.